George Davis. I'm the executive director here of the museum, and we're just very honored to have this program here tonight at our museum. I wanted to briefly just give you a little background about the museum. The museum is a state museum. We've been around since the 1980s. Our mission is art, history, and culture with a focus on California African Americans. We have 4,000 items in our permanent collection. And the last several years, Los Angeles has been transitioning to be more of a city with contemporary art. Many of these artists are African American that are getting acclaim around the world, so we want to make sure we're relevant for them. Also, most museums, for the most part, cater toward an older audience. And so part of what we wanted to do with some of the new leadership here was to make sure we're very relevant to a younger audience and just what's happening in the country. So this is a great indication of that program. I'd like to first off acknowledge some of our volunteers and staff. First off, we have one of our board members here. They're appointed by the governor, Ms. Terry Holloman. And her daughter, Simone, who's a fellow Trojan. Okay. If we have any of our volunteers, please stand to be recognized if you're a volunteer of the Docent Council. Okay, or former volunteers. I know you're here, I saw a few. Okay. And so we have the staff in the black t-shirts. I want to acknowledge Chella Montoya for putting the program together. As you can tell, I don't want to say anything wrong, but she's very close to having a baby. So she'll be with us for another week, and then she will have maternity leave, so we wish her well. Also, we had the passing of Aretha Franklin recently, and it just so happens we have an exhibit here, How Sweet the Sound, Gospel Music in Los Angeles, and Miss Aretha Franklin had a live audience at a very prominent African-American church here in Los Angeles to sing Amazing Grace. It, to this day, is the largest, it sold more records than any other gospel record in history. So a lot of the founders here, they really wanted to make sure there's a unique journey on the West Coast and that the African American journey, a lot of times people think of the South, Atlanta, DC, Chicago, Jim Crow, they're not really aware of what's happening in California. So that's the people here, and that's what our focus here at the African American Museum. So tonight, we have also wanted to introduce Jacqueline DuPont Walker. She's on the Metro board. Metro's putting billions of dollars in these trains. Please stand up, please, Ms. Walker, to be recognized. Jacqueline DuPont Walker. And also a very good friend of CAM and a very good friend of Expo Park. So tonight, gOD-Talk, a Black Millennials and Faith Conversation series. This six-city conversation series sponsored by the Center for the Study of African American Religious Life at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., in association with the Pew Research Center, explores the dynamic ways Black millennials engage with religion and spirituality today. We have, the last several years, been a Smithsonian affiliate, which we're very honored to be part of that through the gracious support of Sony Pictures Entertainment. Also, the director of the museum in D.C. is named Lonnie Bunch. He started his career at our museum, so that's just something that's good history to know. When we had the original opening here, it was Sammy Davis Jr., Bill Cosby, and Denise Nichols. And so it was just, the back of the 80s, so he was here at that time. So this time I'd like to introduce Mr. Brad Braxton. He is the director for the Center for the Study of African American Religious Life at the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. Welcome very much, Mr. Braxton. Thank you. Dr. Braxton.
Good evening. Good evening. I am Brad Braxton, the director of the Center for the Study of African American Religious Life at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. It is a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the National Museum to gOD-Talk. We are delighted to collaborate with our partners, the Pew Research Center, the California African American Museum, and the brilliant leaders who will talk with us tonight. We are especially grateful to the Lilly Endowment for its generous underwriting of this audacious undertaking. A chief characteristic defining people of African descent on the continent and throughout the diaspora is a deep appreciation for spirit. Africana people are spirit people, and we define spirit in marvelously diverse ways. Spirit can be transcendent beings, tribal gods, elemental forces, human capacity, community wisdom, and rituals and artifacts that facilitate a higher consciousness of our sacred place in an expansive universe. Tonight, we will examine how socially engaged and social media savvy African American millennials are defining and redefining spirit. We also will explore how they are hosting and cooperating with spirit to refashion a world that is more equitable, inclusive, and compassionate. In the long ago, Africa's children who were forcefully brought to America's shores created a religious song. Every time I feel the spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. May the conversation tonight, in its reverence and irreverence, in its creativity and compassion, in its rugged honesty and its raucous humor, be a form of passionate, provocative prayer. Permit me now to introduce my colleague at the center, the visionary who orchestrated this innovative initiative and the moderator for the conversation, Teddy Reeves. Teddy is a native of North Carolina. He holds a bachelor's degree from Hampton University, and if you give Teddy 2 minutes, he will talk to you about Hampton. Show loves some Hampton. And he has a Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Seminary. He is a PhD candidate at Fordham University. Teddy is an ordained clergy person and a leading millennial voice. Teddy, on the wings of spirit, take us on this journey.
All right. Good evening. Oh, y'all can do better than that. Good evening.
Good evening.
And welcome to God-Talk. We are extremely excited to be here. Thank you so much for being here this evening. For those of you who are here live, for those of you who are streaming with us, we welcome you to this conversation. And I am so excited to have each and every person that is sitting here today in this place. I know this conversation is going to be robust, and I know that we will walk away better for this conversation. So jumping right into it, I want to introduce our panelists for this evening, from starting here on my right and working our way down, Dr. Bashir Muhammad, who is the senior researcher at the Pew Research Center. Beside him is Candace Bimbo, writer and theologian, known for the 443 blog posts and many other writings, including the Lemonade Syllabus, which followed the visual album by Beyonce. Beside Candace, I would like to introduce Mr. Tyree Boyd Patz, who is the history curator here at CAM. and also the curator of the How Sweet the Sound Gospel Music exhibit, which we are partnering with this program with, and the exhibit closes this weekend, and I commend this exhibit. Those of you who are streaming with us, you may not be able to see it, but those of you who are here in person, we encourage you to see the exhibit during our intermission time and before it closes this weekend. Beside Tyree is Dr. Ryan Cobb. He is the assistant professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Texas at Arlington. And finally, Pastor Michael Fisher is a gospel recording artist under the name of J Kingdom, local radio host and pastor of the Greater Zion Church family here in Los Angeles, California. Let's welcome all of our panelists for this evening. So we have a group of talkers here tonight, so we're going to jump right into it, all right? So I really want to start the conversation. We broke the evening conversation up into two panels. One is faith in context, and the second panel is faith in community. Our first panel is really to ground the conversation in what's going on with Black millennials. And so I really want to start the conversation with Dr. Muhammad, who is from the Pew Research Center, to really pose the first question to you. But before we pose the question, I did want to go around with the panelists and allow them to self-identify. Again, this conversation is open, and we have people from a myriad of different faith traditions and backgrounds represented on the panel. So we wanted to make sure that that was also shown throughout the conversation. So I'm going to start at this end with Pastor Fisher. If you would just briefly say your name and what faith tradition you come from.
My name is Pastor Michael Fisher. I'm the senior pastor of Greater Zion Church family in Compton, California. And, we have Baptist roots, if that makes sense. Yeah, so Baptist.
All right.
My name is Dr. Ryan Cobb. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Social Work at the University of Texas at Arlington, and I am Progressive National Baptist.
My name is Tyree Boyd Pates, and I am someone who's actively decolonizing his faith while never forgetting the ancestors who I stand on the shoulders thereof.
Yes. Hey y'all, I am Candace Bidlow. I was born and raised missionary Baptist. I am also a womanist who loves the Spirit. So my faith roots are now spread a little bit wider than the Baptist tradition, so that I can fully affirm all parts of me.
Bashir Mohammed, I'm a researcher at the Pew Research Center, as you heard, and I'm a Muslim.
Awesome. So Bashir, if I can start the conversation with you, what is the current state of millennial participation in organized faith traditions, and what does it mean?
Well, I think to answer that, I think the basic point I would make is that millennial faith is representing a crossroads, representing sort of two broad streams that we see in American religion overall. First, Black Americans tend to be more religious and more spiritual than Americans of other races. On the other hand, we see that millennials tend to be less religious and less spiritual than older adults. And so in the intersection of those, we see Black millennials who are more religious than other millennials, but still less religious than older Black Americans.
So in that, if we're talking about that, we're seeing a generation of Black millennials being less religious as the previous generation. What are some of the factors, and I'll open this conversation up, what are some of the factors, and I definitely will want to hear your opinion on this, Pastor Fisher, but what are some of the factors that contribute to Blacks leaving organized religion? Bashir, was that anything that came up in the research that was done?
I think that we see a number of factors to that. Broadly speaking, Black millennials tell us that they have a sort of mixed views toward the church. On the one hand, they tell us that they do believe that the church does a good job. Many say that the church does a good job in creating community, does a good job in helping the poor. On the other hand, they have real concerns about some of the church's views on things like sexuality. For example, the majority of millennials, Black millennials, say they believe that homosexuality should be accepted by society, whereas many churches, many historically Black churches, are still very conservative on these issues.
I would think that from some of the millennials that I've talked to, conflict is in practicality. Everything is too mystified, right? And so they're like, I just Googled this answer. I need you to be able to explain this too. And don't just give me, well, that's how we've always done it. So there seems to be no explanation happening in the church, which is frustrating a lot of millennials because they come there looking for answers and they assume that the preacher or the pastor or the elder or the great potentate or the bishop or whatever the title is should be able to give them basic answers such as, why do we put this doily on our head? Why do we all have to wear white? Why do I have to put this band around my arm? And when they keep getting met with, because that's how it's always been done, they're like, I'm out, because we're not an ignorant generation. Give me specific answers, and then I'll rock with you a little bit more. So that's something I've seen.
I think personally as a millennial myself, I think this generation is probably one of the most information-based generations of all time. And we're constantly wanting to engage our parents and our foremothers and our forefathers about the faith that they pass on to us, but they don't have answers. And when I personally was asked to stop critically thinking about the ways my life and the intersections thereof interact with my faith, and I was told to pray about it, I was dissatisfied. And I know many of millennials, particularly those in this room, are dissatisfied with that. And we can never shelve the critical mind that we've gotten through education for the faith that we bend our knee on.
Yeah, I think when you, particularly looking at African American women, young sisters, we watched our grandmothers, we watched our mothers work in churches tirelessly. And then we also watched them be mistreated in those same sanctuaries, right? And then we watched them go home and be mistreated by the men that were in their family. Many of whom were deacons and trustees. Hello. And so we realized that there was a disconnect between what was being preached and what was being lived in and pondered upon in the everyday lives of Black women. And I think that when you are looking at a generation that was as equally formed by the church as we were by hip-hop culture, and having the access to education, having the access to what it means to be able to name our own kinds of traumas, we are not going to be sisters that just stand idly by in sanctuaries and suggest or believe that God sanctions our mistreatment, right? And so I think that when we try to name what's happening with Black millennials, particularly young African American sisters, the move away from the traditional church and fully embracing indigenous African religions and alternative forms of spirituality, because there's a wholeness there that we have to really think about the ways in which the church has done damage to us spiritually and emotionally, and those spaces help to remember us.
So since we're here, we might as well stay and park here for a little while, right? Candace, you brought up gender. When we're talking about Black millennials in faith traditions, and we're talking about gender, we're talking about sexuality, those are some sticking points for a lot of millennials as to why they leave organized faith traditions, right? So I want to get your opinions and open really this conversation up. If we're going to go there, we might as well go there, right? So if gender and sexuality are sticking points and are important issues for millennials, what needs to be done in our faith traditions to begin to address these issues in a full and honest way?
I think that when you have a generation that everything is out in the open, right? Back in the day, you liked certain superstars or artists because there was some sort of like a secret, you didn't know how they lived, right. you didn't know that they ate Panda Express, That's not this generation, right? So they're following celebrities and they know everything about that celebrity and still choosing to call them that icon, and they know everything about them. So the church is going to have very real and honest and transparent conversations about gender, sexuality, how we got there, the reason why it was allowed. For example, I was one of the ones that wrestled with this whole notion in the Baptist church that women could not preach. And I was like, what? Because the very first person that preached to me was my mama.
Yeah, right.
You know, she was the one that taught me how to pray. And I came up and my father was a pastor. But it wasn't my father that taught me how to pray. It wasn't my father that taught me the disciplines of church. It was my mom. So I could not digest that women could not be used by God. And especially when you look in the Bible and you see all of the women who actually not only were used, but they ruled and they started churches and they ruled the church. And Paul just checked in with them. You know, we have to have those open conversations and actually admit that there was a time when church was used to enslave our women, and that because there was a chauvinistic disposition from a lot of preachers and pastors who were intimidated by the knowledgeable black woman, that's the reason why they continuously allowed it to foster. So we have to have those kind of real conversations that grandma and granddaddy probably don't really want to have, because now we're starting to find out those behind the scenes things that, you know, you may think that we will look down on you upon, but we'll actually respect you more for admitting that there's absolutely no reason why it is that we didn't allow women to preach, other than the fact that we were intimidated by them, the end. And then we'd be like, cool, thanks for telling us that. I appreciate you, and I'll see you on Sunday.
Anyone else for that?
I mean, so what's interesting to me, right, is that as a sister, and I'm sitting here thinking, like, I probably shouldn't have told my grandma to live stream this, but there is something inherently ungodly about a faith, a doctrine that tells me that I can't experience joy and pleasure, right? So, and that I have to wait until I am quote unquote chosen by somebody who's going to be trifling anyway, right? That, you know what I'm saying? Like, that I have to wait until, you know, he finds me. And then only the pleasure should be reserved for the fact that I'm going to bring him a son, right? That there's something inherently ungodly about that. That even as black women are trying to navigate this world spiritually, we're also trying to do it very practically. Like, we have to very strategically maneuver through this world. If a brother comes up to us and asks us for our name and our telephone number and we don't want to give it to him, we don't even know if we're going to come out of that exchange alive, right? So there are so many other forces that practically beat us down every single day, and then you want to tell me that I can't experience the one thing, intimacy, that will literally allow me to remember that I am human and remember that I am loved and worthy of love, because I don't have a ring on my left hand, right? There's a way that millennials, black millennials, are pushing us to have a theological reformation that is long overdue, right? I would honestly say that I think that our grandparents and older generations are actually primed for these conversations. We just got leadership that will say behind the scenes to us, oh, I agree with you. I know all of these things, but I can't preach it in my church, right? You have grandparents who, I was just talking with a grandmother a couple of weeks ago who is raising her granddaughter, who came to her and said that she identifies as a young woman. She's trans. This grandma was like, all she has is me. She said, I don't know nothing about that. Help me figure it out. I don't want my baby to go to hell. She ain't got no daddy. She don't have a mama. All she has is me. She is come, and she could not go to her pastor because her pastor said, keep calling him a boy until he realizes that that's who God made him, right? So our grandparents, our communities are asking these questions, and I think that millennials, we are pushing forward this theological reformation to really begin to think through what it means to have faith, who God is. God is not just, the gray-haired, bearded dude that, that is petty, the way that we have been taught that God is. But I think that we are ripe for that, but we have to push leadership to go in those directions.
So if this theological reformation, as you say, Candace, has not happened, and in many spaces there is pushback for it happening, then we're seeing millennials disengaging with these traditions, right? So I like what Tyree said. He said, I'm decolonizing, right? The work that's been done on them. So if they're leaving, where are we going, right? That becomes the question. So if we're leaving these faith traditions, if we're walking out and saying, if I cannot be whole, if I can't be myself, if I can't stand in my truth, then I'll leave. And the research is showing that they're leaving. Where are we going?
Brunch. No, I mean, that's real. Brunch is the new black church, right? Like, we will give $50, and I mean, in New York it's more than that, but we will tithe to brunch, right? Because we are at a table. We just had some brothers go to Trump talking about seats at the table a couple of weeks ago. But like, we will sit at that table at brunch, knowing every single person around that table with us affirms who we are. And God will meet us there, right? So we're going to brunch. We're going to the kickbacks. We're going to, we're going to museums. We are in so many spaces that we are forcing the church we're in the streets protesting, right? We are forcing the church to reckon with the fact that that the spirit is not confined to four walls. And I think that the work that activists within the Black Lives Matter movement did on the ground in Ferguson really forced the church, to think through, no, we're not waiting on you, right? We're not waiting on you. We're not waiting on this Messiah to say that this is the move, right? We're finding different spaces. And so, I mean, I think that, there are people who can speak to where statistically we're finding ourselves and where we are going. But a lot of us are on social media having hashtag church. Right. Where we have found a community of like-minded individuals, and we'll spend an hour refreshing a hashtag, knowing that we can get more in that hour on that hashtag than going to somebody's 8 o'clock service and having to side eye half of the sermon, right? So I think that we are pushing people to realize that something that Black folk have always known, and Dr. Braxton said it, is that spirit could never be confined, right? It could never be confined. And millennials are pressing folks to recognize that.
And I think, going along with that, millennials are moving to any place where they can have constructive conversation that ends with, and then we're going to do this, rather than going to places where it is just be pacified, just wait, sooner or later it's going to happen, joy comes in the morning. They don't want to hear that. At our church, a lot of things that I preach, and a lot of things that our young adults do, it talks about the problem, but I'm big on solutions. So if we're going to come together, we need to come together, talk about the problem, and then actually leave with a practical way to solve it. So we're not just going to have prayer meeting and a cake sale afterwards, so we're going to pray, and then we're going to go out and we're going to change policy, and we're going to rewrite some laws, and we're going to press some of these assembly members that come and take about 5 minutes about actually changing law that will affect us in a positive way and put some textbooks in our classrooms. So I think that that's where the millennials are going. Any place that when they leave from that brunch and having mimosas, they leave from that place saying, and this is what we're going to do by the time we meet again. So that includes brunch, wherever that may be.
Well, and this things like Bashir's work, Pew shows, some of the spaces that the millennials are going to they're moving from historically black religious traditions to predominantly white congregations. So I'm sure some of you watched Joel Osteen. That's a mega church, as well as racially diverse but still predominantly white. Rod Parsley, as well as in Atlanta. So what we're seeing is that increasing percentages of blacks are just leaving these black spaces to go to white spaces. And we haven't quite figured out what that means when your racial consciousness is being shaped by Joel Osteen.
That was shade, sir.
I was saying this is tonight. My family watches Joel Osteen, and God bless them for that, as well as some other people that I just don't fully agree with. But what does it mean when we're black and we are religious, but our religion isn't, or our community isn't black?
Right.
Well, I think after we're going to brunch and we're going to check our phones, church is the shade room, right? Like, church is brunch. Church is shade rooms. Church is IG. Church is Twitter. Church is Black Twitter. But also, church is your therapist. Because if we really want to have this conversation, and I don't know if we really are, my newest pastor is my therapist. Because for much of my time within the religious confines that I found myself in, my church couldn't resolve the childhood trauma that I had. The formative trauma. Things you can't just pray away. So now I seek a licensed professional who is able to deal with a black man who is navigating many spaces and who can speak directly to those mental issues. I think I got an in there corner. Who can speak to the mental issues that not only I'm facing, but many black men are facing, that only perpetuate the cycle of violence that black women like Candace have to survive against, right? And I think if more of us start to have that mental health conversation within the four walls of the church, we actually might get to the root of what we've really been praying about all along.
I'd just like to build on some of what's already been said with a fairly minor, but I think important point, which is that what we don't see is we don't see people saying that they don't believe in God. It's not that if you ask millennials, you ask black millennials, do you believe in God? They say yes, overwhelmingly. But then if you dig a little deeper, is that the God of the Bible? Right. There you see some real differences. Younger folks are much more likely to say, no, I believe in a broader spirit. And whereas the older generations were much more committed to a more specific biblical concept of God. So that's a change that we see over the generation.
So that leads me into another question. I mean, I had a question about social media, but I'll come back to that. You kind of touched it, but I think you really are moving us to this conversation of spiritual but not religious. Right? As you said, the data is showing that millennials are believing in God, but believing in God in a more broader and all-encompassing way. So my question is the popular terminology spiritual but not religious, is the designation too simplistic? Right? Are spirituality and religion opposing realities, or are they related in important ways? Does spirituality need religion, and does religion need spirituality?
So I think that on that point, so we've explored this in some of our data, and one of the things we see is that for most Americans, including millennials, including Black American millennials, religion and spirituality are linked. The most common, if you ask people, do you consider yourself a religious person, and separately ask, do you consider yourself a spiritual person, the most common response is yes to both. It's not an either-or pattern. It's this idea that, no, I can be religious and spiritual, and if I'm not being fulfilled by these things, I will leave both. And increasingly we see among young people, the number of young people that say that they're neither spiritual nor religious is actually significantly larger than it is among older adults. That's not to say that we aren't seeing growth in the spiritual but not religious. We are. But this is broad across our society. It's not just among young people, older people as well are increasingly saying that they're spiritual but not religious. It's just not the majority. The majority are saying that no, these things are linked to
I would think that a lot of times when people answer that question, it's from their own context, right? I would think a lot of people are sitting there with the Webster Dictionary. So it's their own picture of, when you say religious, you think about church. Sunday morning, all day service. And then you have, I'm a PK, sorry, pastor's kid. And then you have spirituality, right? Which is about, prayer, meditation, or, zoning in between you and God and having that inner peace. So I think when a lot of people are saying, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, they're saying, this is a generation, and I was just telling somebody this the other day. So, in the black church, there was a time where the black church was about what you looked like, because that was the only place where you could look like something, right? That's where you could go and you could be a chairman of a deacon board, and it actually mattered because you couldn't be CEO of anything else. So they went to church and they were chairmen and they were presidents of choirs, and they thought they was really doing something great because that was where they could be, right? Now, though, we have entrepreneurs, and you have people by the time they're 25 running their own companies, making money. So they're no longer coming to church for position and title. They're coming to church so that they can get that inner peace, what Christ would say, would you want to be made whole? They want to leave there being made whole. They want their peace. They need to know what it is that I need to center on, where I need to focus. What is God saying about this situation that's happening in my neighborhood right now? And because they're not getting that, they're going and they're getting what I like to term religiosity, right? Choir sings the A and B selection, announcements from the announcer clerk, preacher preach, you're going to hoop in E flat, and then we out of here. And nobody brought me out of depression. And I'm sick of it, so now what I'm going to do is go to the therapist and I'm going to pray. I'm still spiritual, I'm still seeking God. I'm just not going to go to church to do it because they're not seeking Him either. So I'm just going to go ahead and do this on my own time. So I think that's what that means by they're spiritual but they're not religious.
So, and we're going to get ready to take some questions from the audience, and we had people submit questions that they want to pose. But my question is there any hope for Black organized religion, right? And is there a future, right? As millennials are disengaging, or some of them are staying, right? Not all are disengaging. Some are staying in these organized faith traditions and staying through a lot of different things, right? But is there hope for these traditions that at one point were the bedrocks of our communities, right? Led movements. Chicken was fried in the basements of these places. Movements were paid for. People were sent to college from these places, right? Is there a future for them? And do we believe we still need them?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, I'll say for me, I am someone who my commitment to the church is as theological as it is feminist, right? I'm not leaving Black church space because Black church space is Black women's space, right? My mama worked in the church. My grandmama worked in the church. And for me, because wherever Black women are, our presence immediately and instantly makes that space holy, right? So I'm not leaving the church because it is Black women's space. But I also love, because I'm not leaving the church, I love it enough to push it to be well, right? We are still frying chicken. Like, a full disclosure, Teddy and I grew up in the same church, right? That church gave us scholarships to go to school. We got the same little Bible that they gave us every time, somebody graduated. But it meant something, right? When we go back and the elders and the senior citizens of that church can can look at us and say, you was running around that church at 5, look at you now. Right? That means something not only to them, but it means something to me, right? I want my children to have that same experience. I want my children to have a healthier experience than I did, right? We still are sending children, we still are sending young folk to college. We still, the number one, for many in our communities, the number one social service program in our community is church. I mean, the money that comes in on Sunday is going right back out to emergency assistance Monday morning, right? And so we still need our congregations. I will also say this too, that even though this is a conversation about Black millennials, I think that we also have to push our churches to think more intergenerationally. Because if we want to be real, it ain't just the millennials that churches are being trifling towards, right? You know, if many of you may not know, like if your grandmama or your granddaddy can't come to church for a certain amount of months, haven't paid tithes for a certain amount of months, they're no longer on the roll, right? Which means that people who have served in churches for 50 and 60 and 70 years, because they are now 70 and 80 and 90 years old, they're disposable, right? So if we don't think through pushing conversations to say that this church space has to be as healthy for my grandma as it is for me, as it is for my daughter, then what will happen is, if Black millennials reclaim the church space, in 50 years, our grandchildren will do the same thing to us that's happening to our grandparents, right? And so we have to really think through a theology and an ethic that, and I mean, we have it, hello womanism, hello Black liberation theology, but we have to implement the theological aspects of wholeness and healing that really push us to think intergenerationally about what it looks like to have a healthy church. So there is hope, but we got to do something too.
Right. I believe, yes, there is hope. My question, what I kind of wonder is, how will the Black church look? Will it still have this normative African-American experience and this understanding of Blackness, or will the Blackness, or their understanding of Blackness begin to change over time? I tend to believe that it is going to change in ways that may reaffirm or not reaffirm the original thing.
I would like to say, first of all, I really hope there is hope for the church. I'm a pastor. No, but seriously, I think there is hope for the church. You know, the churches have to be willing to evolve. One thing that I love, I try to point this out often, and this messes with some people's theological understanding of God, and I'm like, you know, God evolved. They were like, what? I was like, he evolved in his approach to humanity, right? So in the beginning of the text, it's never Old Testament, New Testament, it's all one Testament, but in the beginning of the text, you have God who dealt with them in the mountain. You come to the mountain, he's mystical, he's invisible, boom, 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 you know, clouds, Moses' voice, you know, and then when that didn't work, he sends his son through Christ, who is now tangible, right? Then it goes from that to the Holy Spirit, which dwells within. And I just think that the church has got to be willing to just evolve and say, what is God calling the church to do now that will reach this next generation? And it did its thing for the previous generation. This next generation is really looking for an organization that will take care of its community that is around it, that will actually get out in the streets and take up the fight. And we saw that with what happened in Ferguson. And that's one of the biggest problems I know in the hood, in like Compton and Chicago and other areas. They want the church to be more apparent in everyday struggles that's happening. So when somebody gets killed and there's a drive-by, what is the pastor and those members actually going to do to try to bring down the crime rate in our inner city? So the preachers are going to have to look at how God is challenging us to evolve the church to minister to this generation. And the last thing And this probably won't get an applause. One of the things that I don't like is how sometimes my generation and the millennials, oftentimes when they get frustrated with a thing, they leave it. And I tell people, you can't change anything from the outside. And so if everyone leaves the church, then the church will remain all the things that you hate about it. You have to stay, and sometimes you have to go to war. It even happens scripturally. Sometimes you got to go to war until it is that God gives you victory in that institution, and then you get in position, and then you can actually change it.
So one of the privileges I have working at this fine institution is the ability to investigate aspects about the Black experience in the West, right? And so there's an exhibit behind me, which I curated, which I'm very proud of, called How Sweet the Sound. And I know that when the pastor fails, and the deacon fails, and the mother fails, gospel music holds us together. We all know Mary, Don't You Weep. We all know all these amazing songs. So I have the leisure of being able to investigate what these songs meant to the people who wrote them. Like Thomas Dorsey, Precious Lord, Take My Hand. Lead me on, let me stand. Come on, y'all know the words. These songs, when we didn't have the therapists that I referenced earlier, they carried us through depression and angst and frustration when we didn't have any insulation from white supremacy. Do you understand what I'm saying? And still carried us through. And so this exhibition behind me, it was dope to find out that Chance the Rapper might have referenced James Cleveland. But I know that my generation is not going to pick up Andre Crouch. I know my generation knows what Andre wrote, right? But let's go back to the history of how it all started. And so this exhibition, I really made it for the church, like the Black church in particular that's here in South Central. But every single day I see people from South Asia. I see people from India. I see people who aren't even of the same faith who write out cards and say, I'm agnostic. But even gospel music has pricked my heart. Do you see what I'm saying? And so I think that if the four walls fails, our music saves. And I hope that, that's a word, right? Our music saves. And I hope that we can rely on the composition of some of the greatest composers that our communities have ever had, because we can rely on what they wrote for us when the scriptures made me fall.
So I said that was my last question. I do have one more before we open up. But so we're talking about hope, right? And there being hope for our religious spaces, right? And I want to make sure that we are inclusive of religious spaces and talking about hope for all. But is it religious spaces' job to try to reclaim those things? Right? Is it our job to try to reclaim those who say that I'm spiritual but not religious? I'm no longer, a part of these organized faith traditions. I found something that works for me, right? How do our religious spaces begin to work alongside millennials and others who find other routes, right? Or find other spaces and say, this works for me, but I still want to be a part of this institution because I know what it's meant to our community, and I want to work alongside. Is there room for that type of work?
Yes. I think that, one, is it our job to go and reclaim? That's the whole parable of leave the 99 and go get the one. It is absolutely our job to go and reclaim those that have become frustrated with the church. As long as it's done with transparency and honesty. It's not always the devil that took them away. Tell them the truth. Me as a pastor, yes, sometimes I want to cuss everybody out too. I understand exactly where you're coming from. Don't leave me. You're a good member. Everything is not divine. Oh, shabbat. No. Tell me that you understand, that you're frustrated as well. The second thing is that same thing with Jesus. When he first meets Peter, he tells Peter, what? Drop your nets, right? I'm going to make you fishermen of men. And then we find in the text later, even all the way after the crucifixion and the resurrection, that what was Peter doing? He was still fishing, which meant that there was a season when Jesus had to walk with him when he didn't drop what it is he told him to drop. And he got to know Peter. Peter got to know him. And then in time, when Peter was ready, he made the decision to go ahead and say, okay, I'll drop these nets now because I trust you because I know you and you know me and we have relationship. And so I think that it is room for us to work with those that we may not necessarily theologically agree with, right? But we need to find those spaces where the struggle is common. Right? So I never agreed with the whole thing, when churches were completely resistant against Black Lives Matter and all of that, because I'm sitting there saying, well, they're fighting the same fight that you're fighting, so just fight it together and then have a theological discussion later at Starbucks, So there's room for us to work together and to let God, I want to say, weave us together, in a way. I love to see women when they get their hair done, and what they do is they line up that track to that hair, right? And then listen, then when they line that track up, then they sew it in, right? But it has to be in a line. There's a part where it lines up before it's sewn in first, and that's what I'm talking about. Walk together. Then let God weave us in. If I was in church, I would tell you to slap your neighbor high five, but I'm not.
Well, I don't have a neighbor, so I'm just not there. So I want to open it up. We have people to submit questions online, and we have people that are submitting questions here. And so I really want to get as many questions in before we go on our first break to prepare for our next panel. But this question is coming from Clinton in Fort Washington, Maryland. Hi, Clinton. How do you think religious hypocrisy has affected the numbers of those who attend church? And he uses as an example the recent Catholic priest scandal, right? How can churches change the perception that this, and he's saying churches and other spaces, change the perception that this is not everyone in faith traditions, right? This is not everyone.
Yeah, I think the first, and I think that goes along with what Pastor was saying. First, I think an apology will go a long way. If many of you remember, I think it was a few weeks ago, the hashtag church hurt was trending on social media. And instead of pastors acknowledging that that was a very real experience for so many people, they flipped it and made it a joke. And the truth of the matter is that we saw a lot of people hurt in the church, right? Which is how I push back with you a little bit, Pastor, when you say, don't leave because, sometimes we have to stay and fight the battle. The truth is that so many of us have already been casualties of warfare, right? There's so many of us are just wounded that we don't even have the strength to fight, right? Because we're tired of fighting against institutions and for institutions that aren't even honest about who they are and who they've been to us, right? So you can have a pastor. I was one of those children. My mom was pregnant in the church with me and was supposed to stand in front of the pastor and in front of the congregation and apologize, and she refused, right? And so she had to go to another church. Later on, found out that pastor had all these kids that went with his own wife, right? And so it was like, you got a baseball team full of children. But because my mama wasn't married, and that is only an example of several, we have these pastors who would talk about tithing and the fact that we are not blessed because we're not giving enough to the church. And then 6 months, a year and a half later, a scandal breaks and we see where the money was actually going, right? So if we are not honest, if churches are not honest, and I do believe that even the pastors who, if you are a pastor and you didn't do any of this stuff, you bear a lot of the responsibility and the burden to say, look, I represent represent a brotherhood. I represent some folks that did some dirty and are still doing some dirty stuff. On behalf of us, I apologize. And I can guarantee you that this space will not be that kind of space, right? And then that means that pastors got to do some work. So the congregation that I'm a part of now, the pastor that I have now, love him dearly. Because when we can have conversations, if something was said in a sermon that made me feel a certain kind of way, like I can say, hey, I didn't really rock with what that was and what you said, and we have a conversation, right? He is in tune to one, who his congregation is, what he needs to do in order to reconcile the fact that he is trying to bring back people who've been hurt. So I think that if we are going to be honest about conversations around Black millennials and faith, we have to be honest and say that the hurt is real. And if we're going to do anything about bringing back in, working alongside, because the truth of the matter is that some millennials may respect the church, may say, okay, what y'all doing is good over there, but I don't even want to walk alongside of you because of how you treated X, Y, and Z. You know what I'm saying? And so if we're going to be collaborative, we got to own some stuff.
So I want to, and thank you, Clint, for that question. I do want to get about 3 questions that our audience had, and I want to pose those to you. And I think this question is really what we're here for is to really talk about the breadth of the African American religious experience, right? And so this question came in, and it says, where do Black atheists fit in the conversation, right? When we're talking about faith and we're talking about encounters, I would really want to get with you, start with you, Bashir, to see what is the research saying about African Americans that are identifying as atheists?
The research on that is really interesting. I talked before about the increasing share of Black Americans, Black millennials specifically, who are disaffiliating from religious institutions and who are saying that they're religiously unaffiliated. But that's not actually the same as the share that say that they're atheists. That's not the same as the share that say that they don't believe in God. The share that say they don't believe in God remains relatively small. Most people who are disengaging from the faith communities are doing it and maintaining some tie to a higher power, even if it isn't a biblical concept of God. Which isn't to say that there aren't, as you mentioned, there definitely is a section of the Black community that's sort of explicitly and devoutly atheist, because there is an incredible diversity within the community. We've talked, we've been talking about the church and the sort of Christian traditions, and that still makes up the largest group. But there are Black Muslims, there are Black Buddhists, there are Black Hindus, there are Black members that are sort of reviving the traditional African religions. And so we need to keep all of that in mind as we talk about what does Black faith look like. It looks like all of those things, including atheists.
And I'm excited for the second panel because we have such a diversity of perspectives, right? And to really show that depth and the breadth. And I want to, again, for the sake of time for this first panel, I really want to get to the second question that someone in the audience posed. The question was, we touched on sexuality and the practicality regarding spirituality and women. Can you elaborate? I guess we'll start with you, Candace. Can you elaborate on what that looks like in practice and the interaction between this and the church?
I think in practice, one of the things that I have really been moved by are the number of sisters who have personal altars in their home. The number of sisters who are turning to traditional African religions, to mysticism, to create this fullness of their spirituality. I get my full disclosure. I go to Bible study and I get my tarot cards read, right? And one of my homegirls was like, "You believe in that?" And I said, "I trust Black women with all forms of me." right? With all forms of my help. And so and I believe this, I believe that every Black woman should have a spiritual care team. And these are people who are made up of folks that she can go to for spiritual health and wholeness. I have pastors in my care team. I have a Yoruba priestess in my care team, right? People who can see the various aspects of my experience from completely different perspectives. And I think that is what, although that is not new to Black women, because we've always had big mama auntie men who, could dibble and dabble in some certain things. I think that Black millennial women are embracing it more out in the open and pulling from various different aspects of faith traditions and not feeling like giving themselves permission to say that all these various pieces can come together to create a full and robust spirituality. And I think, and I'll say this as someone who is as committed to the Black church as I am, Black Christian women millennial Black Christian women are not going to have the fullness of their spiritual experience fulfilled through the church. It's just not going to happen. If you are a sister particularly if you are a sister who has a certain ideology and assurance and acceptance of yourself, you're not going to be fully welcomed in the church, even in progressive spaces, because we didn't even get in that conversation about how some progressive spaces, everybody talking about here, she ain't going there, right? So there's a certain way in which our progressive spaces aren't fully there where they need to be on issues of gender and sexuality. But I really believe that if Black women, particularly Black Christian women, if they are going to have a spirituality and a personal relationship with the divine that is sustaining, it cannot fully reside and be dependent upon their experience in the church. It has to be broader than that. And I think that if we go back very quickly, if we go back to the work of Alice Walker and womanism, if we go back to some sisters who are doing some amazing work in womanism and womanist theology, we will see that there's a need to push us to go outside of the church for wholeness. And that is those are practical steps that sisters need to take in order to really fully be well.
Well, we're going to give this Black woman the last word, okay? Can we give all of our panelists a round of applause? So when we return from this intermission, we're going to have our next panel called Faith in Community, and you are up for another treat of a group of millennials that span the breadth of African American religious life. So give us a little time. We'll be right back. Thanks so much.